That was a wonderful panel, and we're about to follow up on it now by looking at the role government, business, and others can play and why this issue is so important. I'll start with a little tale in order to get you back to your seats and then bring out our panel. To put this into context, I reached back to the first person who was a great educational reformer in America, and that was my old friend Benjamin Franklin. When he was a runaway at age 17 and came to Philadelphia, he started himself off as a printer and became a young and successful printer in Philadelphia. But he realized that education was the key to creating a strong community and a strong country. And so what he did was he started a set of lending libraries in Philadelphia, and he started the Academy for the Education of Youth in Philadelphia. When he wrote his proposals for the Academy for the Education of Youth in Philadelphia, he said that it was important both to help the economy of Philadelphia, but also strengthen the security of the colonies and their ability to become a perfect union. He got into an argument with his protege, Thomas Jefferson, who was then starting the University of Virginia. Jefferson said that we should take the best students and educate them and create a natural aristocracy. Benjamin Franklin said, no, every student should be raised to his or her potential, because we don't want to create a new type of a nation that has the same old class divisions of the nation that they were breaking away from. At the end of his life, he was most proud of what he had done for education. He said that these schools that we've started have made the common tradesmen and farmers as educated as the most aristocratic gentlemen in other countries. And this has contributed to our ability to defend our democracy and our liberty. That's what we're going to be talking about on this panel. It's my pleasure to introduce them to you. First of all, Governor Tommy Thompson, the former governor of Wisconsin, and the former U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, and the co-chairman of the Aspen Institute's No Child Left Behind Commission. Thank you for being here, Tommy. John Engler, who's the CEO of the National Association of Manufacturers, and the former governor of Michigan. You can never have too many governors on a panel. John Podesta, the CEO of the Center for American Progress, that has done amazing work not only in education, but so many other areas, as a great think tank in this town, and the former chief of staff to President Clinton. Byron Auguste, the founder and chairman of the Hope Street Group and a wonderful partner of McKinsey & Company. And Janet Murguía, if she's here yet. Janet, you around? She's around, but she'll be coming in just a second, and we're going to make sure that Byron holds a chair for her, if you would, Byron. Anyway, thank you all for being here. I want to start off by talking about the role government can play. And let me start with you, John, if I may. You've heard the problems of the first panel. What should government be doing?
Well, I think that, first of all, the first panel was terrific. And I think that any way you cut the data, trying to focus on this problem with respect to trying to change the way we educate our kids so that they have the opportunity for success ought to be a first-order priority. I think that obviously this came up on the first panel. Where do we see success today? We see it through courageous leadership at the local level, through mayors who have taken on the system, through the work Joel's done in New York with the support of Mayor Bloomberg, what's happening in Chicago, what's happening in Philadelphia, et cetera, what's happening in Denver. So I think that where there's been political leadership at the local level, we've seen success and we've seen performance. At the national level, I think, particularly in the, we've, I think, been through a frustrating Congress in this last go-around in trying to move this reform agenda forward. Notwithstanding, I think that there's a lot of agreement, actually, across the board in a bipartisan basis. The federal government, I think, has an important role to play. Some of those ideas were put out on the table in the first panel, but in terms of incentivizing local reform, I think the federal government could do a lot more to deal with this high school dropout problem, with the notion of getting high-performing teachers into schools, particularly in schools with that really need them, that in poor neighborhoods with minority kids. And one of the issues we've championed is to try to experiment with reforming the school calendar, try to provide more opportunity, as is being experimented with in Massachusetts with good results. But I think that what the federal government needs to do is lean into that, put forward incentives for reform. Those reforms are going to ultimately take place at the local level.
Governor?
I think it's important to be as specific as we can about the role of the federal government. And it seems to me that the one role, and I thought the previous panel was terrific. I was excited that nobody on the panel sought to go and say, well, the problem with education isn't funded. This is a $550 billion enterprise. One of the problems we've got is the data itself. All the data we're referring to is really 2 years old at best. We're making decisions on an enterprise with old data. Federal government's got an obligation to help get the data right, and it's got to be current. One proposal I'd make is to take NAGB, the National Assessment Governing Board, which administers the NAEP test, and basically privatize that, set it outside the government, make it like the NIH for education, put the 10 regional education labs underneath it, because I believe we probably have solved every problem that we have in public education somewhere in America, but try to find the solutions and try to put them in real time. Let's start using modern 21st century technology. Kuriki, the Sun nonprofit now, is using an open source approach on putting the best teaching and curriculum and professional development materials out there. Let people work. Let's use that. Let's get the testing. Let's get NAEP in real time so we know each year how we're doing. Margaret's announcement on graduation rate, very important. Can you imagine we're in the 21st century? We don't know how many kids came to school today in America. We couldn't find that number out. All of us, we left the room to do that. And we can't tell how many graduated last year, earlier this year, back in May and June. Nobody's got that data. That's amazing for a system that spends $550 billion. One of my modest proposals is to have the Gates Foundation take $1 billion, and let's fix this problem, because spending $1 billion against $550 billion, what's that, 0.02% or something? It's an insignificant amount. Let's do something meaningful that's systemic and a real game changer.
The good news is Bill Gates just nodded, so you got your $1 billion. Bill Gates Sr. there, so he's clapping for you.
I'll talk with him later.
Yes, exactly. So, Tommy, speaking of data, No Child Left Behind was supposed to give us a wealth of data. Has that worked, and what should we be doing with No Child Left Behind?
Mixed results. Not that Margaret hasn't tried and has definitely improved the operations considerably since she took over. But the truth of the matter is that John Engler and I have been going back on education reform for 20 years, and we still talk about the same things. And I just would like to bring out a couple points. First off, thanks to you, Walter, and the Aspen Institute, I was co-chair with Governor Roy Barnes. We went all over the country and held hearings on No Child Left Behind. I was quite impressed by the number of people that wanted to testify and come in and talk to us about what they were doing, which had a lot of good results. But the thing that always comes back is that we still don't have the data to determine, as John Engler has pointed out, immediately. You couldn't operate your business today dealing with data 2 years ago. Maybe Lehman Brothers tried, or maybe Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but we saw what happens. And you got to be able to have very up-to-date data in order to make the decisions. That's number one. Number two, you got to have more accountability. No Child Left Behind is working, but the more accountability that we placed in there and put in there and actually enforce, the better off we're going to be. But of course, you get a tremendous kickback and a pushback. But we found in our hearings that it was absolutely necessary to have strict accountability, and people would understand it and not have deviations from it, and make sure the average the AYP was brought up to date, and that everybody had to adhere to it and had to comply with it. Number three, I think it's very important for people to understand that parents need more information. We found that so many parents under the No Child Left Behind really were left in the dark. Schools were not giving them the opportunity to find out what available services are there, and mentoring services, and absolutely necessary for parents who are having underachieving children to be able to go in and be able to get that mentoring service available to them so that their children can be brought up to date, so they don't get so far behind they get frustrated and never really get brought up to date. The fourth thing, which is my personal, fourth and fifth, which are my personal things, which I think are absolutely necessary. And the fourth one is I think we have to go to some degree of merit pay in America for better teachers to be able to encourage teachers to get in. It's a complex, it's a controversial subject, but if you really want your school system work, you're going to have to pay your good teachers better and make sure they get a very good reimbursement for what they're doing, because there's some excellent teachers out there doing some innovative things and are really bringing their teachers forward. And the fifth one, which is mine, which is always very controversial, I think you got to go to as many choice propositions as possible. Government has got to be able to do this. You got to be able to allow for vouchers. And I know as soon as you say vouchers, everybody gets mad, and I'm not talking about vouchers just for saying that, but I'm talking about vouchers and many kinds of parental choices. And a lot of, like the city of Chicago has done a lot of good things, the city of New York, and allow for parents and children to have better choices, and they will measure up, and that's the kind of good schools that you're going to get started.
We're going to go back to each of the points you just made because I think they're important, but let me ask Byron, when you were at when McKinsey and Company looked at the data we do have, what were the most salient things you found?
Well, McKinsey did a study last year of the best performing school systems in the world, the school systems that have performed the best and also that have improved the most. And what's interesting about it is that in so many of the issues we talk about in the debate, in governance, in curriculum, in standards, a whole range of things, the best school systems do things very differently. So if you take Finland and Singapore and Korea, I mean, they have very different approaches to class size, very different approaches to local versus national control. So those things aren't in common. But all of those systems, all of the top performing systems appear to have three things in common. First, those systems all recruited and retained absolutely top-notch talent as educators into the teaching profession and as principals, and they deployed them to where they were needed most. That was one. Second, they invested very heavily in training and mentoring and onboarding and these teachers. They really took seriously and were a continuous improvement in teaching. And they used that talent to intervene rapidly in the schools and with the students that were falling behind. So they didn't leave it for a year or 2 years or many years as we do to intervene. They really, in virtually real time, they had the ability to put extra resources, extra tutoring, or wholesale intervention in the schools that were failing.
Now, Byron, if you say that teacher and resources is the most important single thing, what about merit pay? What other things can you do to increase teacher quality?
Well, I think that is the question. I think the fundamental question here is really how do we make teaching a great career in this country? Today, I'd say teaching is actually a good job but a lousy career, seen from the eyes of somebody graduating from university and looking at coming into the profession. When I say it's a great job, I mean you're working with kids, you're making a huge difference in their lives, you're seeing progress. Think about Teach for America, which has thousands of the most accomplished college graduates coming into teaching, in fact, competing to come into teaching. So it's a good job. But for the most part, they don't stay because it's not a great career. Why isn't it a great career? First of all, the pay. Right now, we pay teachers in this country roughly starting salaries, on average, about 85% of per capita GDP. In the countries that get great teachers in, it's typically more like 95% or 100% of per capita GDP. So we're about 10 points lower from where you'd want to be. But it's not just the level, it's also the form, which is to say that the most motivated people coming into the profession want to be recognized, they want to be rewarded for doing well. So I do think that performance-based pay is a good idea. Well done. It works and it helps. But more than that, ironically, teaching is not today much of a learning profession. If you're a teacher, for the most part, your experience is being alone in the classroom with relatively little mentoring, relatively little ability to learn from more experienced teachers. We talked about data. We don't have data in the hands of policymakers, but you don't have the right data in the hands of teachers and principals to actually help them as professionals figure out how to improve what each of their kids is doing, how they're learning, how to personalize the instruction for them. So we know how to do this. It is known how to do this, but that information is not in the hands of teachers. And then the final thing about teaching as a career is that what top graduates will say is, if I go into teaching and I stay in teaching, is that going to be my 40-year career? Because young people these days don't want 40-year careers, not in teaching and not in any other field. What am I going to learn? How am I going to develop so that so that if I stay for 5 years, if I stay for 10 years, that I'll have some value in the job market. I'll be able to do something else. So I think we really need to set the bar high. We all talk about, it's a cliche that the 21st century we're in a knowledge economy, and that's true. So if we're in a knowledge economy, the people who impart the knowledge, the teachers, the educators, this should be the iconic career of the 21st century, the iconic profession. So we need to set the bar very high, and I think we won't have fully succeeded until we see GE and Goldman Sachs and Google sending their headhunters to find teachers, to try to recruit our best teachers and principals into their companies. So we need to start opening the debate, I think, much more broadly about how to make teaching a great profession in this country.
Janet, let me turn to you and ask you what you think the most important factors are that we need to reform.
Yes, I think it's really important to hear all of these aspects of this issue, and I commend you all for drawing attention to this. But when it comes to Latino kids in this country, I think a lot of us are familiar with some of the biggest statistics and the demographics. Obviously, the Hispanic community is now the largest minority in the country, but more importantly, when it comes to education, we know that Latino students make up 20% of all the kids in public school systems. Half of those kids are what we would call English language learners. And that becomes critically important when you look at the number of students coming through our system. And if we don't have the right strategies in place, when we know the challenges are out there for our Hispanic kids, everyone's heard the statistics, roughly almost half of our kids aren't making it through the system with a high school graduation. We've got to look at these statistics and demographics. I remember once talking to a president and CEO of a major corporation, Fortune 100, Fortune 50 corporation. And I said, you have these statistics jumping off the page. When it comes to your consumers and your workforce, why aren't more companies doing more to think about diversity, inclusion, and how to deal with this and take advantage of that for your corporation? He said, Janet, you know what? These statistics are out there, and we see them, but it's almost like we're paralyzed because we don't know what to do with them. And I think we as a country have to figure out, we can't be in a position where we're paralyzed when we see these statistics jumping at us, and every day in the classrooms we see what's happening. So for us at the National Council of Auguste at NCLR, we've taken a very research-driven, data-driven approach when it comes to how do you deal with helping these, not just Hispanic kids, but ELLs, the English language learners, succeed. And there are strategies, and the one thing that we can tell you is that embracing accountability is the future for not just the education system, but it's for the future for Latino kids. And we were one of the first organizations when everyone was saying, gee, are our kids going to be able to meet those standards? Of course we have to set high standards for our kids. We do need to make sure that the resources are there, and we need to make sure that the right strategies are in place to do that. And I will tell you that the data shows that despite the attitude having been previously complaints about this is too hard, what we are seeing when it comes to Hispanic kids is real success when we've looked at some of the data. Now, obviously, we need to see more success in this area, but one of the things that's also fascinating is we've talked to teachers out there, and one of the attitudes has been in the past that these kids can't learn prior to No Child Left Behind. And now what we're seeing is, what can I do to help these kids learn? Because one of the key things has been embracing standards and accountability and understanding that when we do that, we can force everyone to have those standards set and accountability systems set so that all kids can succeed. And these kids don't have to be special projects. They're part of everyone's responsibility for succeeding. So ELLs and Hispanic students, I think, can offer a key to turning our system around if we will look at it.
John Podesta, you were nodding on the embracing accountability and standards. You want to build on that?
Well, I think that I think Janet's exactly right. I think that we need to look at who's performing, who's not. We're a little bit in a circle here. You need the data in order to have accountability, in order to have a real performance-based pay system. You actually have to have some fairness in that system so that people are able, and there are experiments going on around the country that have show real promise, I think, to show that the actual impact of what's going on in the school in particular, in general, and in the classroom, to show that that this isn't just a mere system of favoritism, but that people are actually being paid for additional performance, so that you're looking at accountability. But that kind of comes back to what Governor Engler said at the beginning, which is that we need strong data associated with the ability of to kind of track, mark, and look at what's working and what's not. I think I just want to associate myself with one thing the governor said at the beginning, which is almost every one of these problems has been solved someplace. The question is, how do you scale these things up? How do you apply them across large systems where you have a tremendous, I think, disparity in school budgets between what's going on in poor neighborhoods versus what's going on in middle class neighborhoods? Those kind of questions are ones that I think have to be attacked with a hard look at what's at the data at the national level. It goes to the standards question. It gets down to the school system level, and then ultimately to the school and the kid.
Well, I think that we're on a very interesting topic here, because if you look at public education, and we saw the 15,000 school districts put up there, but it's interesting. Look at their technology needs, for example, which is part of the key to data. There's really two things they're doing. They're running an HR system. In other words, they're paying people to keep track of the benefits, and they're running a student record system. You talk about commodities, those are it. Those two big commodities. And yet we got 15,000 one-off systems for the most part around America. And you could save literally millions of dollars that you would have available for doing lots of other things with if you simply standardize that. And you would standardize it in a way. I have two daughters in public schools and in middle school, and one in a private school. And it's interesting just the differences in those three schools in the information. But in the one school that effectively uses Blackboard, I literally know every test, every quiz, every homework assignment, both what's expected and what the result was. It just comes to me on the BlackBerry. I can look at it and say, Maggie, what about this? And it's there. Now that capacity should just be built in the system. Regardless of whether or not the parent's ready to use it or not, it should be ubiquitous across America. That should be there. And the feedback systems for the teachers and that, again, there's plenty of very good examples of that. And to Roy Romer made the point, if we'd have performed where the 10 nations were, if we simply performed to the average best practice in America, everywhere in America, we would have a quantum leap forward, and we would rocket up that list in terms of our standing among other nations. So we're not talking about something that somebody hasn't done already somewhere. We're talking about applying lessons learned, lessons that work. And it's not so much about the reinvention. I think we make it more complex, and in education, because they don't have the market pressure that my manufacturers have. If you make a widget better, next year everybody's going to buy that widget unless you can get there. In education, if the school across town is better, the next school will launch a study to see, well, what could we do? And then they'll try some untested new program that some vendor shows up with to help out, or they'll say, well, we've got a mandate, we can't do that until Joe retires because that's really his area, or Mary's the curriculum head and we really don't want to upset her, so we'll wait a couple of years and she's leaving anyway.
Getting to your manufacturers and the fact that they have to compete in the market and somebody will go across town instantly if they're not competing, that really ties into what Governor Thompson was saying about choice as well, whether it's a voucher system or charter system or whatever, allowing parents both the data and the ability to make the schools compete. Is that, whether Governor Thompson or Byron, you want to take that on?
Well, one thing I'd say about some of the great charter schools that have been successful is that, back to the point about teaching, in a way, a lot of the choice strategy is really a human capital strategy in disguise, because what they're able to do is they're able to create an environment where really passionate, creative, hardworking teachers feel like their work can be recognized, can be rewarded, that they're not saddled with bureaucracy, et cetera. And so they do great things. I think KIPP is a great example of that. I mean, KIPP has been very successful, and it's great that it represents a choice. But what's also great about it is they're phenomenal at training their principals. They really are thoughtful about what makes a great principal. They then attract great teachers. They train them in a certain way, and there is a KIPP way of doing things. So I think, again, I think that creating sort of these choices, it can be a good thing, a stimulating thing, but it only matters if it ends up changing the core of the system, and if it ends up getting better teachers more effectively working in the system. And I agree entirely with this point about data and being able to scale that. There is a lot of best practice, and until we have quality data just ubiquitous and saturating the system, it's going to be very difficult for those best practices to move quickly.
I have 3 quick points based upon what the discussion has come up with. First off, when we set up the commission, which Roy Barnes and I went around and held hearings on under the tutelage of the Aspen Institute, it was amazing to me that the vast majority, not everybody, but the vast majority wanted strict accountability and strict standards. We came back and reported that to Congress, and everybody recognized the importance of that, but we still could not get Congress to act. And so when the original question was, what should Congress do? The first thing we should do is we should strengthen No Child Left Behind, because it is working. And if you strengthen the standards and the accountability, you're going to improve the educational abilities and opportunities for children around this country. The second thing is, in regards to having, as John Engler said, ways in which you can measure accountability and standards. When I was Secretary of Health and Human Services, we set up standards and quality standards for the nursing home industry, which was never set up before. Now, anybody that's going to put their parents or an elderly in a nursing home can go online and find out 12 standards in every nursing home in America. And everybody knows that. Now, nobody ever thought the nursing homes could do this, and they were farther behind than the schools were. But now you can go online and find out where you want to put your mother and father based upon quality standards. That's what we got to get to in education. And the third thing is, there are some fantastic voucher schools out there, as well as charter schools. But I'll just give you one. There's a voucher school in Milwaukee called Mesmer that has a 98+% of their children going on to college, 80%, and they have a 99% graduation rate. And over 85% of those individuals are minorities and on fixed lunch and on school lunch programs. And so they're poor, they're minorities, and 98% of them are going on to college. It's one of the best examples, and we don't ever hear about that because it's a voucher school. But it is an example of what can work and does work out there in the marketplace.
John, there was a political consensus that formed a few years ago behind the notion of accountability and standards, and that seems to have frayed a bit. How do we get the consensus back on some of the reform ideas that are not supposed to be attacking teachers or attacking schools or attacking anything, but creating the possibilities for reform in education?
Well, I think it goes to the point of the panel behind us, which is we're here feeling urgent about a problem which the public isn't feeling so urgent about. I mean, I think you see it in certain local communities, and I think that the places where you've had this local leadership there's a deep sense that of change happening, of standards being put forward, of accountability, et cetera, of political leadership really, I think, coming to the fore. But I think one of the things that we have to be honest with ourselves about is, as we're yelling about the urgent call, cutting through the data, looking at what it's doing to our economy, suggesting that there's social disparity and lack of cohesion in our society, I don't think, politicians are lagging indicators, not leading indicators. The fact that this, Senator Obama just gave a speech on education earlier this week, or last week, and embraced some of the things we're talking about here today, including performance pay and getting rid of bad teachers, et cetera. But it hasn't been a top-level item in the national dialogue. And I think, again, if you go back and look at what happened in the course of this Congress, I don't think that people felt a lot of pressure to move forward with the accountability agenda. Bills stalled in both the House and the Senate on elementary and secondary education. So what is it going to take to lift that back up? It seems to me that there's a core set of items, again, that we've been talking about that I think where there is consensus on a bipartisan basis on both sides. Probably would disagree with my friend Tommy about where to begin that conversation. But I think that there's bipartisan agreement on how to reform high schools, on how to provide better pathways for kids getting into college, how to improve the performance with respect to not just getting kids to start college, but to complete certificates and complete degrees. Some focus on that. There's, I think, a consensus in the country on both sides on the role of preschool and creating more investment in that. And I think that's probably going to have to come through federal dollars, even notwithstanding the budget mess that we're in today. So I think there is an area of consensus, and I think the question is, how do you, again, rebuild that bipartisan middle? But I think it's going to take some pressure from the bottom of the system. And again, with all due respect to the first panel, to all the people here, to the sense of urgency that maybe all the people in this room feel, I don't think the political world is feeling that pressure coming from communities across the country.
It's such an interesting dilemma because everybody knows football season's underway. Everybody knows if their team is winning or not. They know where they rank in the league. They have no concept.
Packers beat Michigan.
No, we don't have a pro team in Detroit anymore. Haven't had for years. But in the high school leagues, you could be last in science in your league for 20 years. You're not firing the science coach. If you're last in football 2 years in a row and don't win games, you're getting a new coach. And again, why? Because you keep track. And it goes back to, and that's part of the dilemma, though, because that's exactly what some worry about, is that kind of accountability is coming back. And you get into Congress this ideological divide where you've sort of got on one side, we don't want this information because you might hold somebody accountable and somebody might be imperiled in their job. On the other side, it's kind of, well, this is all local control. We don't want Washington, screwing around in these local decisions. And both sides are wrong on that. And I think there is a consensus that when Tommy goes out around, or when Roy Romer's working, a lot of these, and the governors have been out in front, but it's interesting how the fight back against some of the governors has been interesting, because they've actually tried to go around and say, let's put the chief state school officer, in other words, let's put the establishment in charge. For heaven's sakes, don't put it in the governor. And when you get it to a mayor, as we did in Michigan with Detroit, what happens when somebody leaves and the next one comes along? They put the school board back, and the corruption starts all over again. Kwame Kilpatrick would be better than the Detroit Public School Board in Detroit.
Janet?
Yeah, no, I just think, John makes a good point. I mean, we do need to create a sense of urgency. And again, if some of these demographics don't create that, I mean, we need to make sure we're connecting those demographics to the different key players on all this. And we need strong leadership, someone who's going to make this a priority. But one of the things I see in terms of how we can approach this is, of course, we need to continue to embrace No Child Left Behind and the accountability and standards measures and making sure all kids are included in that. And I think that's really important. But I do think we have to look at this from a more comprehensive way and a holistic way. John mentioned preschool. I mean, when you look at early child education, the importance that that can have in helping these kids even before they step foot into the school door, it's amazing. And when you look at the number of kids out there right now from the Hispanic community, it's hard not to note that 1 out of every 4 children under the age of 5 is Hispanic. 1 out of every 4 children under the age of 5 is Hispanic. If we know that now, and yet we see Latino kids still have the lowest participation rates in preschool programs. We need to start making adjustments within the No Child Left Behind Act that help us address with some of these challenges that we're talking about. But we need to obviously keep looking outside of NCLB to look at what other support systems do we need to put in place to make sure that we're helping across the board so that it's not all on one law for this to happen, because really we're talking about different pieces. The other piece within No Child Left Behind that I think has not been implemented, that we know research shows helps our kids, is when parents are involved. And there are parental involved provisions, particularly when it came to minority kids, where we could provide more incentives for these parents to be involved, and yet none of those provisions were implemented. And I think we need to look at what we can fix within the No Child Left Behind law, but we also have to look at outside the system what other approaches and what other funding mechanisms are going to be able to help us put in place to help kids that we know if we get them, again, ready to learn when they enter that school door, we're helping ourselves already in terms of their success rate.
Byron, what's the role of business in helping push the accountability agenda? And what have you seen in the past 30 years on that front?
Well, I think business has a number of roles to play, but I wanted to add something about this, about what it's going to take to raise the urgency of this issue, because it's interesting. The U.S., you remember the U.S. in 1965, we were number 1 in the world, and by a long distance in high school, and in 1975, we were still number 1 in the world in college. Why? Because we had a 50 or 75-year head start in some cases over other countries in universal primary education, universal secondary education, broad-based access to college, at a time when most of the world, most of Europe felt that it was crazy to be educating all children, that was a real waste of resources. The U.S. was the pioneer in doing that, and we did it not just from top-down leadership, although there were some real great instances of top-down leadership, but it was a massive social movement across the country. Right, to sort of like in states and communities to insist that no, we're gonna put in places in the 1800s. So the challenge now is the access part is relatively easy. You can tell whether your kids are in school or not, but the quality of the education they're receiving is harder to tell. And so you need a broad social movement. You need groups like La Raza. You need the civil rights movement, but it does need to be empowered by data. And it does need to be empowered by data that gets all the way to teachers, to students, to parents in real time, because it's only, this point about our kids versus other people's kids. Ultimately, I think the broad middle class will only be fully engaged in this when they understand that it's their kids too. It's not just somebody else's kids, and it really is.
You and Governor Engler have made the same point, which is if we have very public data, and everybody can see it, just like they can see the coach's ranking of their college football team or the sports results, then that will help do what John just talked about, which is really make an urgent call, actually an urgent call. People get upset when they notice that our kids in this school are last in math. John, go ahead.
Well, I think Joel raised the point of national standards, and our work with the Chamber of Commerce has really focused on truth in advertising, because as long as you can dumb down your test so that you look like you're doing better, you're disguising the fact that you're failing, at least as against other states or other local school districts. So I think that whether that comes in the form of a voluntary national standard, or I think Joel was suggesting that that Congress actually just pass a national test and move forward with some.
mean, so what is the end? I mean, we used to hear in Michigan, there would be schools, they'd look across the county and they'd say, well, they're spending $500 more a student. If I only had that money, I could be, no telling where I'd be. Well, now we've got Michigan, after we did the school finance reform, there's 300 plus school districts, all have the same money per pupil. Guess what? There's vast differences even with exactly the same socioeconomic data, and so it comes down to leadership and structure and accountability, organization, a whole bunch of other things that are in there. One other point I'd make is that in this, I think K-12 missions, is sort of straightforward in the sense of it's hard to do, but we need, and this remediation report, the cost remediation report that is being released, that Governor Romer's had a part of it, very, very important report, I think, and long overdue, because kids need to leave the high school age either ready to go to college without needing remediation or going to the workforce with a skill that's been measured and certified. Not everybody should go to college. I mean, I am in the movement that says not everybody needs to go to college. We need lots of people with lots of skills, and there's, in the manufacturing workforce, we need technical skills. This is America, you may choose to go to college later on. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that once people get skills, get nice incomes, they think, I'm going to go back and finish my degree, or I'm going to earn a degree. But we need the skills, and the dropout rate has to be zero. Dropping out in America today is the single dumbest decision a young person can make, because now you're choosing to compete against the cheapest unskilled labor anywhere in the world. I mean, that is the single dumbest decision, and it represents basically an average of a forfeiture of $90,000, $100,000 of taxpayer money that your taxpayers are willing to invest in you, young person, and you've just thrown away. So what are you telling an employer? If you're going to throw $100,000 of somebody else's money away, what will you do with my money on the job? We don't need unskilled labor today.
Yeah. Let me get Governor Thompson in.
I agree with the absolute necessity of data. But there is one other factor that's just as important that has been lacking in the last several years, and that's leadership. When the report came out that our schools were doing very poorly in the 1980s, first President George Bush held a conference with all the governors in Charlottesville and set the standards and the goals for the year 2000. And all the governors came and immediately ignited a fervor of governors across America. In the 90s, led by several governors, including Roy Romer and John Engler and Mike Leavitt and Tom Carper and several other ones, we held 2 educational commissions. And the governors took it upon themselves to lead on educational quality in their states. And there was competition. I can remember John Engler always looking over his shoulder at Wisconsin, and we were looking at Michigan trying to beat each other out, trying to lift them up or whatever. But the competition came from governors all over the United States, Democrats and Republicans on a bipartisan basis, and we'd come to our meetings and we'd figure out what was new and innovative out there. We would steal it from whoever had it and would take it home and dress it up, and we would trot it out as our own ideas. And there was just this, and then the business leaders, Lou Gerstner, John Pepper, came out, and they got involved with us governors in the 1990s and really took it upon themselves. So it was governors and leaders. And then George Bush II came in and set up the new standards, and immediately Teddy Kennedy, and it was a bipartisan effort that got it through the Congress, and everybody was rallying around it. Since then, we've lost focus, and we haven't got the dialogue going in Congress or in the presidential campaigns. We have got to get back to leadership and the expert leadership that we had in the 90s and the early 2000s in order to reignite educational quality. And the standards and the data are equal, but it also requires that leadership component.
But it's harder to have leadership, it would seem, if you don't have a scoreboard in bright lights that everybody can see. And so, yes.
I was going to say there's some other places we could look for support, because I agree absolutely with the point on leadership, as I do with data. And you asked before about what the business community can do. I would say CEOs, there is I think Governor Engler's right. There's definitely a sort of an education reform fatigue at that level. But there is an enormous amount of commitment to improving education that's out there, more broadly speaking, among people in the private sector. That now, with new technology, networking technology, Web 2.0, et cetera, we can tap into. I mean, Hope Street Group is an organization of professionals, mostly in the private sector, across the country, committed to economic opportunity. Right now, you have, historically, it's been very difficult for someone who has a full-time job in the private sector to really commit meaningfully. You can go tutor in a school, or you can vote for a candidate that you think could do something about it, but there's hardly anything in between. There's an enormous amount of problem-solving expertise in the country that actually can be deployed against this challenge. And when we talk about economic opportunity to our members across the country, the biggest single thing that they want to contribute to is education. So we're working to find ways, and there's tangible ways. There's a lot of expertise in training, for example, out there. I mean, GE has one of the most outstanding training capabilities in the world. What if GE were working very closely with teachers, with the teachers' unions, with administrators, et cetera, to figure out what are the best ways to train teachers? How do you make teacher training and professional development, which I think most people agree today is mediocre at best, how do you turn that into world class? Because there's been a lot of investment in it. And there's a whole host of these small challenges that we deal with in the private sector all the time that we can reach out and get more people in business, not just at the top, but throughout the private sector involved in.
Well, I'm really nodding my head on the technology. I think that is woefully underutilized as a tool to help. It does several things. It can personalize education. It's a tool. It's not replacing a teacher, but it's helping, and it's making some aspects 24/7. I mean, you've seen states now where half the schools didn't have an AP course offering, just have anybody teach it. Now they've got a dozen or more online available. One of the popular things that we had was not only the course we set up at Michigan, but the course reviews, and that became a teaching tool. But teaching math, teaching economics, teaching some of these where graphing is important. You've got to have high speed. You need broadband, but I mean that also today is it's not all there, but much of it is. And again, I think sometimes we want the perfect becomes the enemy of the very much better. And in this case, build this, and the demand will be there for it. But I think the use of this as a tool, and as I said earlier, the kind of the Sun system, the curricula that they put out there, that's going to help. We've got individual teachers all over America struggling with their lesson plans, working that out, and why there's spectacular lesson plans for the same material. Why aren't we continuing to simply use the best of the best, and the weakest teacher ought to have the best sort of lesson plans and be able to go online and see how units are taught. If there's a concept that's particularly difficult, and say the physical sciences, you've got downloadable units that you can use, and that's the power that can really. And I think it also helps engage kids the way they maybe learn a lot.
Well, the good news is that technology will both allow accountability and standards to be more visible and more transparent, but also allow best practices to be shared more easily. Certainly at KIPP Academy, when they learn how to do something right, every KIPP Academy, whether it's in Gentilly in New Orleans or in Houston or in New York, knows how to do it. And we at Teach for America, once a lesson plan really works, the technology shares that, so every 7th grade math teacher can share the knowledge of how that works, and they can be held accountable if it doesn't work. We just have to use technology in those two forms. Speaking of which, I would love to go to the audience. I think there's some system set up, which I was briefed on. Is Jason Cameras around, or people are supposed to help facilitate discussion from the audience? Is that Jason, anybody?
We can just throw
somebody wave
up.
hands and tell me hello. If not, raise a hand. I know we're not supposed to do it this way. Yeah, go ahead. Actually, just shout it out. You don't have to worry about getting the microphone on because we don't want speeches, but yeah. Go ahead. Just say your question, or yeah.
Rights, And the role that Jason and I were asked to play today was sort of a people's moderator, a community moderator. We had the opportunity to talk to some people between the sessions, and I had a couple of questions that I think maybe this panel would like to address that arose during the last session. The first question has to do with international competitiveness and the achievement gap in this country. And one of the speakers in the prior session indicated, and I've often thought this myself, that we could actually increase our performance at the top end of the achievement distribution in this country and do much better, maybe even very well, in international competitiveness with countries like India and China, countries that we know leave many children behind. And we could do this and still maintain a very hefty, large underclass in this country. And I'd like to know some thoughts from the panel on that particular issue and what perhaps the moral imperatives are and how they work against or with the economic
Okay, so we got
imperatives.
the competitive and moral question of the great education divide. Yeah.
Well, I think all of us could speak to the moral issue. I want to speak right now to the economic issue, the economic competitiveness issue, because I don't actually agree, based on the evidence I've seen, that we can get to global competitiveness in education without closing the achievement gap. I think if you actually look at the best performing countries in the world, who are not yet China and India, right? But say Finland, which actually is generally the highest ranking in these things. If you look at Finland, it's no coincidence that they not only perform very well at the top end, but they've got the lowest variation, which means to say that the poorest kids in Finland from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, and there are folks in Finland from disadvantaged backgrounds, they tend to do fairly well too. And their schools, the variation among schools is very little. And I think if you dig underneath this global competitiveness gap in education, you'll see that about half of it is due to our achievement gap. About half of it you could get there by just improving how the already pretty good, pretty well performing kids do. But you have to close the achievement gap to get this. And the economic consequences of that are huge, because in the end, in business and economics, productivity is destiny. It is what is the value of the products and services that the average worker can produce in an hour, in an hour of their time, in a day of their time. That's what drives it. And that is not only about inventions and innovation from our leading scientists. That's about the ability of frontline workers in service industries and manufacturing lines to continuously improve, to have the judgment, the knowledge, the critical thinking skills to spot something that can improve, to share it, and that is what's going to, I think, move the country forward economically.
John? Yeah.
John?
Yeah. You first. Two Johns.
Real quick on that, there's no if I took it to mean economic competitiveness, maybe also in there in terms of. There's no question that we need the innovation at the top end. We're an innovation economy. We've got to have the science, the math, the technical leadership, the very high skills. But we also, if we're going to maintain we're the #1 manufacturing economy in the world. If we're going to maintain a strong manufacturing base, which I think is pretty essential to having economic strength, then we've got to have a manufacturing workforce. Today, that's not a manual labor, backbreaking kind of job. That's thinking. That's using computers and lots of technology today, and the productivity that's allowed us to be internationally competitive has been driven by technology. But so it's many fewer workers, a lot like agriculture actually. I mean, a lot fewer people on a farm, but the output's up there. We'll have a record output year for manufacturing in America this year, but we're doing it with fewer and fewer people. But they're having to work a lot smarter. So even that non-college bound kid has got to have an achievement gap that's closed in order to do the kind of work that's waiting for them, that'll make the product that some other really smart person figures out ought to be produced here.
Yeah, I guess I would just add one thought, which is that I think that the greatness of America has been built around not just the productivity gains, about a quarter of which were in the last century were directly the result of higher educational attainment in the United States, but also because of the values that the United States was built on, which is built around human dignity, opportunity for every person, the capacity for everyone to succeed in the country. And I would hate, actually, for the economic analysis to end up disguising that fact. There are a lot of countries in the world that have produced great wealth with a very, very high top-end wealth and a very, a lot of disparity between the rich and the poor in their countries. I think our country has become the greatest country on earth because we've focused on creating fairness in the system, giving opportunity to every kid in America. And if we forget that and rely simply on economic analysis, I think we'll forget what really makes America the greatest place on earth. So I think we need to stick with those core values of equity in our system and focus on that. And I appreciate what Byron said. I don't think he was suggesting something different than what I was saying, but it's important, I think, that we remind ourselves of that as well.
But I want to disagree a little bit. My disagreement is not on the economic ones, because I absolutely concur economically, but I really believe that locking poor children into non-performing schools is going to be a huge civil rights issue, and should be a huge civil rights issue. And that's going to require good data to determine how the schools in that particular city or county are doing, and have some comparative rights, and be able to then allow those children and their families not to be locked into a poor non-performing school, but to be able to have a choice to be able to go to a school that is performing, which competition-wise is going to bring up the non-performing school in order to maintain their student base. So I really sincerely believe the questioner was talking not only about the wealthy and the elite and the ones that are performing highly, but she's talking about the poor non-performing, and they need civil rights. I think their civil rights are being affected by being locked into schools that do not perform.
I'm just not sure what we're disagreeing about. I think that, I think the focus, you're disagreeing with the questioner? Oh, okay.
Well, I'd just say if we're going to break the cycle on these non-performing schools, I think we have to look at the data and statistics, but the most important statistic are these children. Every child is a statistic out there, and we need the resources to invest in these accountability systems so these kids aren't left behind. And for us, if we're going to break that cycle on non-performing schools, we've got to stay focused on these standards, on the accountability systems, and making sure that our values are coming through when it comes to this. We're doing this not so that we'll be just the best school, but so that these kids will actually achieve their full potential. And if we don't forget about the fact that we want these kids to achieve their full potential and still get those high goals and standards, we're going to be just fine. But we got to remember that it's both.
But if they can't move to a better performing school, they're going to still be locked into that non-performing school, Janet.
Yeah.
And that's why they have to have that opportunity.
They absolutely need that opportunity, but the question is, let's break the cycle on the non-performing schools and let's get them up and make sure that
competition is the best way to do that.
Sure, we need to have competition, and we need to make sure our values are demonstrated through that competition.
Yeah, do you want to talk about competition?
Well, no, I didn't want to talk about competition. What I wanted to talk about, though, is the link between what John and Janet are talking about the core American values of opportunity and the school system and the economic argument there's a book published this year that I recommend everyone here read by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz called The Race Between Education and Technology, and it looks at the last 150 years of education in the U.S. And what it essentially says is that up until 1970, while the demands of technology were increasing the demand for people with skills, our public education system was winning the race. It was delivering more and more people with higher and higher skills into the workforce. And what that meant is that we had, in the first 70 years of the 20th century, not only very robust economic growth, but we had greater income equality. That is to say, the poor were getting richer faster than the rich. And that, that's not just about money. That's about opportunity. That's about health. That's about a whole bunch of other things. But that's what was happening. And after 1970, that stopped happening. We kept having fairly decent economic growth. It wasn't a disaster. But now it was the top end that was pulling away from the bottom. People in the middle and the bottom were not keeping pace. That part of the American dream was not keeping pace. And why? Because it's fundamentally because while technology kept racing ahead, the public school system did not improve as fast as technology. Our schools were losing the race, and ultimately that is what drove the income inequality that we're seeing in this country. So I think the economic argument and the moral argument, if you will, are very much interlinked.
Today's editorial page in the Wall Street Journal does an excellent job of explaining the growth of two-wage and two-parent families and middle class. It's a wonderful explanation on this, but I think the real crisis in America has been that it used to be possible for somebody with no skills to make a pretty good income, and that's not true today. And so we get back to the idea that everybody's got to stay in school and get a skill. If you simply drop out, you are really, even the military doesn't want you at that point. And we've got to fix that problem, and they've got to stay in school. And this country pays for public education. This isn't like a lot of places where you got to go scrape the money together. We'll pay for it. Tommy,
let me push John a moment, because he talked about the core values of America being opportunity and equity and fairness, something you wrote about in your book. How do you implement that in a school system that's now two-tiered? How do we break that achievement gap?
Well, I think that, look, there are experiments going on around the country on that. I mean, Tommy suggests one sort of strategy. In Chicago, they've gone in, closed the schools, started over again, brought in a whole new staff, and had pretty good success with that. That's not, they I think understood that the parents in those neighborhoods were going to largely, they're dependent on the public schools. They need to send their kids in a local community environment. And so they've had a different strategy. It's a pretty radical strategy. I think they've had pretty good success. Same thing is going, I know you're more familiar with what's happening in New Orleans now. 50% of the schools, I think, are charters. I mean, but it's in the public school system, locally based, trying to find solutions that work in their own neighborhoods. I think at the congressional level, at the national level, look, going back to President Johnson, we tried to do something to affect education for the poorest kids by passing Title I, and yet there's a loophole in Title I that doesn't that still permits I think resources to be inverted. If you look at funding at the federal, state, and local level, the schools that the kids, I guess, that need the least help, that is, they have the most resources from home, still get the most resources in the school, and the kids who need the most help get the fewest because of the way funding works. It is true. It is true if you look at if you account for particularly if you account for teacher salaries and don't use a standardized teacher salary point. Some states are better than others. Some local communities are better than others. But that's still a feature of the federal law that I think needs, could be addressed, could use some attention, so that what's happening again in these places that have shown some promise, some signs of success, like New York, like Chicago, like Philadelphia, New Orleans, go take the resources that are necessary and apply them against kids, demand accountability. We've thrown lots of statistics out here, but the difference between a high-performing teacher and a low-performing teacher could be as much as 1 year's difference in educational attainment for the kids in that class. I think we got to focus on that, try to address it with strategies that work, and again, I think that there's promising experiments all around the country. The question is, how do you create that urgent call that scales those up, that applies them across the board, and moves the whole system forward?
Later on, you're going to hear from teacher leaders here on the stage, but I think one of the political questions is sort of the willingness from people who were trapped in bad schools to break the political axis that's been in existence in many of the urban communities. and that's been very, very tough because that's more about politics than it is about education, and thus far politics has beaten education on some of the reforms that we're talking about. There are some courageous leaders who've been out there, but as Tommy found, there's very few Polly Williams in the world out there, and a lot of pushback going the other direction.
And I just want to underscore one thing John said, which is it's urgently needed to get the high-performing teachers in the highest need schools. And whether you're talking about money or anything else, the big problem is some of the best teachers aren't going into some of the highest need schools.
And the best way to accomplish that, Walter, is passing No Child Left Behind with increased standards and accountability.
Right.
That is going to drive it faster than anything else.
And the resources to fund it. I mean, we agree. We run 100 charter schools. We know about competition. We know about best practices. We want to take them to scale. But let's face it, we cannot fund this law on the cheap and talk about how great it is. We need to make sure it's funded. But the training that needs to be there for teachers is something that we have to make sure we're doing right. And again, we're all, I think, embracing the same concepts of wanting to support this. But let's be clear, this thing isn't going to happen by competition alone. We've got to make sure that the law that we have
enacted. And it's not going to happen by money alone either.
I'm not talking about money alone. I just said I embraced competition. We've embraced, we've gone out there on the political limb to say that we embrace standards and that we want accountability. We're
absolutely
out there saying that. All I'm saying is that let's not forget that the nuts and bolts also involve funding this law if we're going to say we support it. And I think that's really important. And you talked about, Governor, you talked about politicizing some of these issues. There's a lot of people trying to demonstrate courage out there all the time. And I just have to say this, or I wouldn't represent my constituency out there, but when it comes to these English language learners and trying to figure out how to incorporate these kids in these accountability systems, there's a lot of people that want to throw these kids are undocumented immigrants or worse about that. And they try to use that to politicize us against trying to see reforms that will include this. But the statistic out there is clear. 90% of the kids that we're talking about in our school system are American kids. We're not talking about undocumented kids coming in and really forcing a wholesale change in these school districts.
Janet,
so
let me
there are
real
people trying to stand up to that politics.
Right here, and then we're going to end it. Yeah, right here. Just speak up, and I'll repeat it. We will take you up on that challenge. I think you're exactly right. I'd like you to meet with me and Gary right after this, Gary Huggins, because by the end of tonight, we want that 10 or 15 person group, just like you said, to hold the notion of accountability, data transparency, and find ways we can get that moving. So it's not just discussion. We want to come out with an action plan, and that can be action plan number 1 on our agenda. Final words from the panel?
I just want to underscore what you said about getting great teachers into the highest need schools. And then our next panel has teacher leaders and school system leaders, and I'd love to hear them talk about how we can make that happen with a sense of urgency.
Last thought is there's $550 billion being spent today. There's not enough private philanthropy to replace the $550 billion. We better figure out how to spend that well.
Right. Anything else, Governor?
I just think if you're really going to solve the problem, you're going to have data, you're going to have choice, you're going to have leadership. And I think all three are lacking right now.
Thank you very much for a very interesting panel, and look forward to the teachers coming up next.